The war horse put his groom through the paddock fence for the second time that week, and I stood at the rail counting the seconds it took the man to rise before I knew he would not last the month. "Get Torin," I said. "Tell him find another hand for the black." "There is no one left to ask, my lord." My steward wiped rain from his brow, though the morning was dry, sweat more likely. "We have gone through every groom in Cinderhall who will still come near him. The stable boys call him cursed. Some call him grieving, as if a horse could grieve past reason. He can, I had seen it. 10 years since my brother Casimir fell at the Bracken Ford with that same horse beneath him, and the animal had never again suffered a saddle, a bridle, a hand laid flat against his neck, without answering in blood. I had kept him anyway. A man does not put down the last living thing that carried his brother into a fight and carried him home again, even broken, even riderless, even half-mad with whatever horses feel when the world goes wrong beneath them. I was Alaric, Alpha King of Cinderhall, and I could face down a war party of raiders from the eastern moor without my pulse changing its count, but I had not gone inside that stall in 3 years. I told myself it was because I had no time. It was because I could not look at that horse without seeing my brother's hand on his bridle, and some griefs a king cannot afford to indulge in front of his own men. "The council will ask again why you keep him," Torin said, more gently now, because he had known me since I was a boy too small to reach a stirrup, and he alone in Cinderhall still spoke to me as though I might be persuaded rather than merely obeyed. "Lord Ansel already calls it a soft indulgence unbecoming a war king. He'll say it louder now that the blacks put a 4th man in the healer's care this year. Let him say it in my hearing and not behind it then." I had no patience that morning for Ansel's opinions, which he offered the way other men offered weather reports, constant and mostly unwelcome. "The horse stays. Find me a groom who will not flinch from him, or find me nothing at all, but do not bring me talk of putting him down before the sun is even proper over the wall." Torin had the grace not to answer that. He only bowed his head and went to see to the injured man, and I stood alone at the rail a moment longer, listening to the black's breath come hard and fast from the dark of his stall, a sound like a bellows worked by grief instead of fire. That was the morning I first saw Briar. She was down at the far end of the stable row, forking soiled straw into a barrow with the unhurried competence of someone who had done the work so long her body no longer consulted her mind about it. She did not look up when the injured groom was carried past her. She did not look up when I walked the aisle with my steward trailing complaints like a torn cloak. She only paused, fork planted, when we reached the black stall, and she watched me the way a woman watches a man about to make a mistake he will not be talked out of. "You've an opinion," I said. I do not know why I said it. I had not spoken to a stable hand directly in years. There was no need with Torin between us. "I've a name for him," she said. "Nobody's asked him it in 10 years, seems to me. Everyone's too busy asking him to behave." I looked at her properly then. Plain wool dress, sleeves pushed to the elbow, hair bound back and dusted with chaff, a face that had not been arranged for anyone's admiration in longer than she'd care to say. She was not what my hall would have called handsome. She was what my grandmother would have called sound, the kind of woman built for enduring weather, and for telling the truth to men who did not want to hear it. "What is his name," I said, "in your accounting?" "Duskwing." She said it like she was certain of it, though no record I owned called him that. His rider called him that. I heard it from old Finn before he passed, the one who used to keep the tack room. Everyone forgot it because it hurt too much to say. Something moved through me then that I had no word ready for, not the cold recognition I felt before a battle, not the warm loosening of wine after a long ride. It was more like a string drawn taut between 2 stakes I hadn't known were driven into the ground of me, humming once, low and going still. I did not understand it. I did not stay to examine it. A king has a stable full of trouble and no patience that morning for riddles. "Stay away from that stall," I told her. "I've buried enough Groom's pride this decade. I won't bury a woman for it." She looked at me with an expression I would spend the next month trying to name, not defiance exactly. Certainty. With respect, my lord, I wasn't asking. I should have dismissed her on the spot for the insolence of it. Instead, I found myself walking away without another word, because some part of me already knew she would go to that stall the moment my back was turned, and some smaller, more dangerous part of me wanted to see what would happen when she did. I asked Torin about her before midday, telling myself it was only prudence, a king's ordinary caution about who moved freely among his animals. She was called Briar, he said, daughter of a hedge healer from the low villages past the mill, come to Cinderhall 3 winters back with nothing to recommend her but a way with wounded creatures that no one had trained into her, and no one could quite account for. She had mended a hawk with a shattered wing that every falconer in the kingdom had already given up for meat. She had talked a bull back down from a killing rage in the market yard with nothing but her voice and an open hand. She kept to herself otherwise, ate apart from the other grooms, and had refused twice an offer to work in the kitchens where the pay was better and the danger considerably less. She could have an easier life, Torin said, in the tone of a man who did not understand why anyone would choose otherwise. "So could I said, and did not explain what I meant by it because I did not yet understand it myself. She did not go to the black stall that day. I know now she was too clever for that. She watched him first, the way you watch weather before you decide whether to trust it. For 3 days she only carried water past his stall and set it within his reach without meeting his eye, the way you would with any creature too proud to be seen wanting something. On the 4th day I came down before dawn, unable to sleep, and found her sitting on an overturned bucket 6 feet from his door, talking to him in a voice pitched too low for me to catch the words. The black stood at the back of his stall, ears hard forward, nostrils working, every line of him coiled to break something. He did not break anything. He simply watched her the way I had watched her myself, like a man deciding whether a stranger's calm was a trick. I did not announce myself. I stood in the shadow of the feed room and listened to a groom murmur nonsense to a horse that had put 3 men in the healer's care that season, and I felt that same taut string hum again, closer to a chord this time, and I told myself it was only fatigue. Lord Ansel found me there before I could retreat, as men who wish to be noticed always seem to find a king at his least guarded moment. He looked at Briar on her bucket, at the horse still coiled and unconvinced behind her, and made a sound in his throat that was not quite a word. "A stable girl talking to a beast that has broken better men's bones than hers," he said. "You'll forgive me, my lord, if I do not share your household's patience for it. There are simpler mercies for an animal too far gone in grief to be of use." "He is not for your use," I said, "or anyone's. He is mine to keep, and I will keep him as long as I judge fit." I kept my voice level, the way I had learned to keep it in every council chamber where a man tried to spend my grief as though it were a coin loose in his own pocket. "You may tell the rest of the council I said so, in exactly those words." Ansel bowed, the shallow bow of a man conceding a point he intends to raise again later, and left me to the quiet of the stable, where Briar had not once looked up from her murmuring, as though the whole exchange had happened in some other kingdom entirely. By the 2nd week she was inside the stall. I want to set down, honestly, what that stall had been to me before Briar came to it, because I do not think anyone in my household understood the whole of it, not even Torin, who had served me since I was a boy. My brother Casimir was 3 years my elder, and where I had been raised to the cold arithmetic of rule, how many men, how much grain, how far a border could bend before it broke, Casimir had been raised, or had raised himself, to something warmer. He was the one our people brought their disputes to when they did not want a verdict so much as a listening. He was the one who could walk into a room of frightened villagers after a raid and leave it calmer than he found it, not through any command, but through the simple, steady fact of his attention. Our father used to say, half in jest, that Casimir would have made a better king and I would have made a better general, and that between the two of us Cinderhall might have had one perfect ruler if we could only have been folded into a single man. We rode out together to the Bracken Ford because the scouts had reported raiders massing at the crossing, and I gave the order that put him at the head of the left flank, because it was the sound tactical choice, because Duskwing was the surest-footed horse in my stables, and Casimir the surest hand to sit him, because I trusted my own brother's judgment over any other captains in that army. The ford ran high that year, swollen with spring melt, and the raiders had known ground we did not. I have turned over every decision of that day more times than I can count, searching for the moment I might have chosen differently, and I have never once found it, which is its own particular cruelty. Casimir fell defending a crossing I ordered him to hold. Duskwing carried him out of the water after, riderless, half-drowned himself, screaming in a way I had never heard a horse scream before or since, and no man among us could get close enough to learn whether it was grief or the raider's blade still lodged near his flank that made him fight every hand that reached for him. We saved his life in the narrow sense. We never saved anything else in him. For 10 years I had walked past that stall the way a man walks past a grave he visits too rarely to feel he has any right to grieve at it properly, and told myself the horse was simply dangerous, simply broken, simply a debt I owed my brother's memory, and nothing more complicated than that. It was easier than admitting that every time I looked at him, I saw the water rising at the ford and heard my own voice giving the order that put my brother in its path. I heard about it before I saw it. Torin came to me white about the mouth, certain he would have to tell me a woman had died on my land for my carelessness in permitting it. I went down at a run I would not have made for most crises, and found her standing at the black's shoulder with her palm flat against his neck, not moving, not currying, not doing anything a stable manual would recognize as work. She was simply standing with him, her hand a small steady weight against a hide that flinched under any other touch like a struck bell. "Duskwing," she said, soft, as if the name were a stone she was setting down carefully so it would not chip. "There you are." He blew out a breath through his nose, long and low, the kind of sound I had not heard him make since before the ford. I stood in the doorway with my heart doing something undignified in my chest, and did not trust myself to speak. She turned her head and found me there. "You can watch," she said. "You cannot come closer, not yet." I, who commanded 3,000 warriors, and had never in my adult life been told where I might and might not stand, obeyed her without a single word of argument. I came back the next morning, and the one after that, always to the same spot in the doorway, always waved off if I drifted a step nearer than she judged wise. She never explained her methods to me, and I came to understand she did not have methods, not in the sense my horse masters meant the word. She had patience so total it functioned like a kind of grace. She had a voice that never asked the horse for anything it could not yet give. She had, above all, the plain, unglamorous habit of returning, day after day, whether he nickered at her shadow or laid his ears flat and showed her the whites of his eyes. She did not flinch from the bad days. She only came back on the good ones as though they had been owed to her all along. "Why do you keep asking him his name?" I said to her on the 17th morning when curiosity finally outweighed my caution. "You know it already. You told me the first day." "Knowing a thing and being reminded of it aren't the same," she said, not turning from him. "You know your brother's dead. Doesn't stop you standing in that doorway like you're waiting for him to walk up the aisle." I had no answer for that, because it was true in a way I had not permitted myself to look at directly in 10 years, and she had found it in 17 days without once asking me a personal question. I did not resent her for it. That alone should have warned me how far gone I already was. "You're not afraid of me," I said, because it occurred to me all at once that she was the first person on my own grounds who had never once measured her words before speaking them to me. I've stood inside arm's reach of a horse who has broken bone for 10 years running, she said, mild as milk. Forgive me if a king with a temper he's never once raised at me doesn't frighten me half so much as you'd like. She glanced at me then, quick and assessing, the same look she gave the black before deciding whether to step nearer. Should I be afraid of you, my lord? No, I said, and meant it more than I had meant anything in council in a decade. I find I would rather you weren't. She seemed to accept that as sufficient answer, and turned back to her murmuring, and I stood a while longer in the doorway with the strange sensation of having just promised something to a woman who had not asked me to promise it, only noticed that I had. He was the only one who could sit that horse, I said instead, because it was easier than the truth. My brother, Casimir. Everyone else, the black threw within the first month. Casimir used to say Duskwing understood him better than our own father did. I had not said my brother's name aloud, unprompted, in longer than I could account for. It came out of me now like something long held behind a dam, finally finding a crack it could widen. Briar did not offer me comfort in the shape my hall would have used, no bow, no careful phrase about honored memory. She only said, "Then he's owed better than to be feared the rest of his days for missing him," and went back to the low murmuring that I had come to think of, privately, as her true tongue, the one she used with creatures who had no other language left to trust. By the third week, she had a halter on him. It took her 4 days merely to accustom him to the leather resting across his stall door unused, another 2 before he allowed it near his ears, and I found I had begun to structure my own days around the hour I might pass that stall and see how far the leather had traveled since the morning before, the way other men might watch the moon for the turn of the tide. Not every day went forward. On the 9th day of the halter's slow approach, Duskwing caught the smell of a passing wolf-pack scout on the wind, some trick of memory or nerve I never fully understood, and reared so hard in the confines of his stall that he cracked a board and very nearly caught Briar's shoulder with his foreleg as she scrambled clear. I heard the crack of wood from the yard and ran the length of the stable with my heart gone entirely out of my own keeping, and found her already back on her feet, dusting straw from her skirts, breathing hard but unhurt, already murmuring to him again as though the moment before had not happened at all. "You could have been killed," I said, and heard in my own voice something closer to a shout than I generally permitted myself. "I wasn't," she said, "and shouting at me for what didn't happen won't stop it happening the next time it might." She looked at me steadily until my breathing slowed to match the sense of what she'd said. "You don't get to keep a grieving thing safe by keeping it small, my lord. You only get to keep it safe by staying long enough that it stops needing to prove how dangerous its grief can be." I wanted badly to forbid her the stall entirely after that. I did not. I think even then some buried part of me understood that forbidding her anything would only prove her point about small, safe things twice over, and I had already begun to want, more than I wanted my own comfort, to be the kind of man she would not need to argue with twice. That night I could not sleep, and went walking the ramparts the way I had as a young man before any of this grief had settled into the shape of my life, and found Torin already there, unable to sleep himself, or perhaps only waiting for me the way old servants sometimes do when they sense a king needs company he will not ask for directly. "You watch her the way you used to watch your brother," Torin said, without preamble, looking out over the dark yard rather than at me, which I understood as a kindness, since some things are easier said to the night than to a face. Before the ford, when he talked some frightened farmer's whole harvest dispute down to nothing in an afternoon. You used to stand in the doorway of the hall and watch him do it like you were memorizing something you were afraid you'd never see again. "I don't know what you mean," I said, which was not true, and Torin was kind enough not to say so. "I mean," he said, "that grief and love have always looked a great deal alike on you, my lord, and I have known you long enough to tell them apart even when you cannot." He turned to face me then, and there was nothing of the steward's caution in it, only the plain concern of a man who had held me as an infant before he had ever bowed to me as a king. She is good for that horse. I have eyes. I can see that much for myself. I only ask that you consider, before this goes further, whether you are drawn to her for her own sake, or because she has given you back a piece of your brother you thought the Ford had taken for good. It was a fair question, and it deserved a fair answer, and I did not have one ready that night. I only knew that when I pictured Briar's hand flat against Duskwing's neck, it was her face I saw first, not my brother's, not the horse's, and that this fact alone told me something I had not yet found the courage to examine in full daylight. By the end of the month she led him, at a slow walk, the length of the stable aisle, and every groom and stable boy on the grounds found some reason to be standing near enough to see it, and none of them said a word, as if speech might break whatever fragile thing was being built one step at a time in front of them. I watched from the same doorway I always used, and the string in my chest did not hum this time. It rang, one long clear note that ran the whole length of me and did not fade. The way a bell struck true does not fade so much as become the shape of the silence after it. I understood, with the same flat certainty I felt before any battle I had ever known I would win, that I was not looking at a groom leading a horse. I was looking at the only person in 10 years of grief who had asked my household's oldest wound its name instead of demanding it behave, and the wound had answered her, because she had never once made it feel punished for hurting. My lord, she had stopped the horse level with me, close enough now that I could have reached out and touched his shoulder if I dared. Would you like to try? He hasn't let a man near him since the Ford. He hasn't let a man near him who asked first, she said. You've been asking me for a month whether he's ready. You never once asked him. So I asked him. I do not know what words I used, something low, something that surprised me by cracking halfway through, my brother's name buried somewhere inside it. Duskwing's ears came forward. He did not startle. He lowered his great dark head until his breath moved warm across my knuckles, and I stood in my own stable with my hand an inch from a decade of grief made flesh and bone, and felt it, at last, let me close the distance. There you are, I said, echoing her without meaning to, and the horse exhaled against my palm as though something in him had been waiting 10 years for exactly that admission. Briar stepped back to give us the moment, the way she had always known precisely how much room a wounded thing required, and I found I could not look away from her instead of the horse, which told me everything I had been too proud or too busy to examine on my own. I asked her, some days later, why she had let me close the distance that morning and not before, when I had been asking to try for the better part of 2 weeks. "'Cause you finally stopped asking me," she said, "and started asking him. There's a difference, my lord, though most men never learn it. You'd been treating me as though I held some key you needed, as though patience were a lock I could simply open for you if you were charming enough about requesting it. But I never held anything. I only waited longer than most people are willing to wait and watched closer than most people care to look, and there's no shortcut through either of those, not for a king, not for anyone." "You make it sound like a discipline," I said, "rather than a gift." "It is a discipline," she said. "I have simply practiced it long enough that people mistake it for a gift, because they would rather believe I was born knowing how to do this than admit they could learn it too, if they were willing to be as unhurried about it as I've had to be." She glanced toward Duskwing, who had begun, in the days since, to seek her out at the stall door whenever she passed, the way a much younger and much less wounded horse might. "It cost me plenty, learning it. I'd rather people not imagine it came easy, even if it makes for a better story that it did." I found I admired her more for that admission than for anything else she had said to me in the whole of that long, slow month, because it was the first time she had allowed me to see the cost behind the calm, rather than only the calm itself. I did not court her the way my hall would have expected, with gifts sent by a page or a seat arranged beside mine at table before either of us was ready for what that would mean to a household full of watching eyes. I went to the stable instead, most evenings, and found her already there, and we spoke of small things, the mare due to foal, the roof of the east barn that wanted mending before the rains, whether Duskwing preferred his oats wet or dry, a fact she had apparently determined through the same patient trial that had determined everything else about him. Ansel raised the matter of her before the council within the fortnight, exactly as I had known he would. He did not name her outright at first, only spoke of the danger of a king's attention settling too plainly on a servant of no standing, of what such a thing might invite from neighboring houses, who already whispered that Cinderhall's grief had softened its king past usefulness. I let him finish. I had learned long ago that a man who is allowed to finish his argument in full will often hear its weaknesses aloud before anyone else needs to point them out. "You mistake the matter," I said when he had done. "You imagine I have chosen to notice her because she is convenient, or because grief has made me careless of my own dignity. I have noticed her because in 10 years neither you, nor any horsemaster this council ever hired, nor I myself, could undo what a single stable hand undid in a season, by nothing more than patience and the plain habit of returning. If that is softness, my Lord Ansel, then I would have this whole council softened by it before the year is through." No one answered that, and Ansel did not raise the matter again in open session, though I did not doubt he carried it forward in quieter rooms. I found, to my own surprise, that I minded this less than I once would have. There is a kind of quiet that settles over a man once he has stopped needing every voice in a room to agree with him, and I had not felt that particular quiet since before the Bracken Ford. I told Briar none of this at first. It was she who brought it up, one evening, with the same plain directness she brought to everything. "Your steward's face when he passes me in the yard says the whole household knows the council's been arguing about me," she said, currying Duskwing's flank with slow, even strokes while he leaned into the motion like a man easing a sore back. "You needn't shield me from it, my lord. I've weathered worse talk than a council's for less reason." "It is not talk I fear for you," I said. "It is that I have put you in the path of men who measure worth by birth and station, and you have neither by their accounting, and it costs you nothing that it should not." "It costs me only what I let it cost," she said, "which is nothing, since I never asked their opinion of me to begin with." She smiled briefly in the lantern light. "You worry a great deal for a king who commands 3,000 warriors." "I have found," I said, "that commanding warriors is considerably simpler than protecting the one person in my household who has never once asked to be protected." There came a night, not long after, when a messenger rode in from the eastern border with word that raiders had struck a village at the edge of my lands, close enough to the moor that Ansel used the news to argue, once more and more urgently this time, that I ought to spend my energies on the kingdom's true defenses rather than a stable girl's slow work with a broken horse. I rode out myself with a company of my best men, as any alpha king must when his people are threatened, and was gone 11 days settling the matter and seeing the border properly held. I thought of Briar the whole ride, more than I thought it wise to admit even to myself, and found that the thought of her steadied me in a way I did not expect, the way a man far from home might carry the memory of a particular light falling through a particular window, and let it stand in for the whole of what he was riding to protect. When I returned, dust-covered and saddle-sore, I went to the stable before I went to my own hall, still in my riding leathers, and found her exactly where I had left her, as though she had simply continued the same unhurried hour I had interrupted by leaving. Duskwing nickered at my step before Briar even turned, which told me something had shifted in my absence that I had not been there to witness. "You came to the horse before your own bath," she said, not quite hiding her smile, "which tells me a great deal about your priorities, my lord." "I came to see that you were both well," I said. "The border reports were uncertain for some days. I did not know whether trouble might reach this far." "We were well," she said. "He fretted the first 2 nights you were gone. I think he has learned to listen for your step the same as I have, though neither of us would have admitted it before you left. By the third night he'd settled. Horses recover their trust faster than people do once they've decided to give it. She studied me a moment, taking in the dust and the weariness plainly written on me. And you, my lord, did you fare as well as we did? No, I admitted, surprising myself with the honesty of it. I found I did not much care for 11 days without this stable in them. She did not answer that directly, only reached out and brushed a fleck of trail dust from my sleeve with the same unhurried competence she brought to everything. A small, ordinary gesture that undid me more thoroughly than any grand declaration could have. You've never asked me why I do it, she said, one evening, brushing chaff from her sleeve while the horse dozed standing, hip cocked, utterly at ease in a way I had not seen him in 10 years. Do what? Stay with the hard ones. There's easier work in this kingdom for a woman who's good with her hands. I could keep house for some merchant and never be thrown into a fence rail in my life. Why do you then? Because everyone else gives up on a thing the first time it frightens them, she said, and I've never seen the sense in that. Fear isn't the same as danger. Most times it's just grief that hasn't found its way out yet. She looked at me sideways, and I understood she was not only talking about the horse, and that she had known she was not only talking about the horse before she began the sentence. You did not learn that tending horses, I said. I learned it burying my mother at 12 and being told by every well-meaning soul in my village that I ought to be over it by spring. She said it without self-pity, the way she said everything, as a fact to be set down and left there. I decided then that anyone who tells a grieving thing to hurry is a poor judge of grief. Horses agree with me, in my experience. So do kings, though most kings won't say so. I laughed, an unguarded sound I had not made in that stable in years, and it startled a soft answering huff out of Duskwing, as though even in sleep he had learned to trust the sound of it. I am not most kings, I said. No, she agreed. Most kings would have put him down years ago and called it mercy. She reached out, unthinking, and laid her hand flat against his neck the way she had the very first day, and I watched the horse lean, infinitesimally, into her palm, the way I found myself wanting to lean toward her voice whenever she spoke plainly to me instead of with the careful distance my rank usually bought from people. Ride him, I said. It was not a command. I had learned, in a month of standing in doorways at her pleasure, that commands were the one currency that bought nothing in that stable. He isn't ready. You said that of the halter and the aisle and my own hand on his neck, and each time you were only telling me the truth a little late so I wouldn't argue with you about it early. I stepped nearer than I had allowed myself before, close enough to see the small scar along her wrist, a old rope burn healed silver, close enough that the string in my chest rang again, warmer this time, less like a bell and more like a hearth catching. Tell me true. Is he ready, or are you? She considered that honestly the way she considered everything, and did not flinch from the question the way a lesser woman might have, eager to protect her own pride. Both, perhaps, she said. Soon. It was another 11 days before soon arrived. I know because I counted them the way I had once counted the days before a coronation, which told me something about myself I was slow to admit even privately. On the day itself she did not send for me. She simply led Duskwing into the training yard at first light, saddled him herself with the same unhurried patience she brought to everything, and swung up before any groom on the grounds thought to fetch me, so that by the time I came running, barefoot, my steward shouting something behind me about propriety, she was already 3 circuits of the yard into the first ride that horse had permitted since the Bracken Ford. I stopped at the yard rail and could not have moved if the sky had come down. She rode him at a walk, then a slow trot, her hands light on the rein, her voice still going, low and constant, the same murmur she had used from the first day, as though the entire ride were only an extension of that first conversation through a stall door. Duskwing's ears flicked back to catch her voice and forward to read the yard, and there was nothing in him of the animal that had broken bones for a decade. There was only a horse being ridden by someone he had decided, over the slow accumulation of 40 ordinary mornings, that he could trust with his own fear. When she brought him back to the rail, breathless, her hair come loose from its binding, her face lit with an unguarded joy I had not yet seen on her, the string in my chest did not hum and did not ring. It broke open entirely, the way a dam gives all at once after weeks of pressure, and what came through it was not grief and was not merely wanting. It was recognition so complete it felt less like falling, and more like arriving somewhere I had been walking toward without a map for the whole of my adult life. "You did it," I said, which was not what I meant, and she must have heard what I meant beneath it, because color rose in her face that had nothing to do with the exertion of the ride. "We did it," she said. "You asked him his name too in the end. That mattered more than you know." I reached up before I had decided to, and set my hand over hers where it rested on the pommel. She did not pull away. Duskwing stood beneath us both, steady as old oak, blowing softly, and somewhere in the yard my steward had gone entirely silent, and somewhere beyond him the whole household had gathered without my noticing, the way households do when something is happening that they will tell their children about. "I have spent 10 years," I said, "believing that stall held nothing but a wound I was obligated to keep alive out of love for a dead man. I did not think there could be anything left in it worth finding." "Grief doesn't empty a thing out," Briar said. "It only waits to see who's patient enough to ask what's still living underneath it." "And what do you find?" I asked her, "underneath mine?" She looked at me for a long moment, and did not answer with a courtier's grace, because she had never once in 40 mornings offered me anything but the plain truth. "I find a king who has been standing in doorways his whole life, waiting for someone to tell him he's allowed to come inside." I helped her down from the saddle myself, my hands at her waist, and for one held breath neither of us moved to step back, the training yard and the gathered household and the whole weight of Cinderhall's watching eyes gone very far away. Duskwing lowered his head between us, unbothered, chewing at some private thought the way horses do, and I found I was smiling at an animal for the first time in a decade without any grief attached to it at all. "I will not order you to stay near me," I said. "I have watched you teach a broken horse that no one earns trust by demanding it. I would be a poor student if I demanded it of you now." "Then don't order it," she said. "Ask." So I asked, the same way she had taught me to ask a grieving horse for its own name back, plainly, without command in it, and she answered the way Duskwing had answered her that first ordinary morning. Not with fanfare, not with any sudden conquering joy, but with a small, steady step closer, and her hand turning under mine until our fingers fit together like something that had simply been waiting, patiently, to be asked. That evening I went down to the stable, as I had every evening for 2 months, and found her there before me, as she always was. Duskwing put his head over the stall door when he heard my step, ears forward, unafraid, and I laughed to find that he had learned to expect me the same way I had learned to expect her, like a good thing arriving on schedule at last, after a very long wait. "He likes you now," Briar said, watching the horse lip gently at my sleeve in search of the apple I had, without quite admitting it to myself, begun carrying down each night in my pocket. "He likes you first," I said. "I am only permitted to like him because you vouched for me." "That's how it works with the hard ones," she said, smiling in the lantern light, chaff still caught in her hair, entirely unconcerned with whether a queen ought to look otherwise. "You do not win them by being owed anything. You win them by coming back." Torin found me in the stable a week later, mending the cracked board Duskwing had put through in his last bad fright, because I had discovered I preferred the plain work of my hands to the endless paperwork of my hall whenever Briar was near enough to talk to while I did it. He watched me a moment before speaking, the way he always did when he had turned a thing over long enough to be sure of it. "You asked me once whether you were drawn to her for her own sake, or for what she'd given you back of your brother," I said, before he could ask it again. "I have an answer now if you still want it." "I would like to hear it, my lord." "Casimir would have liked her enormously," I said, setting the new board true against its post. "He would have argued with her about the mare's feed and lost, and thought it the finest afternoon he'd had in a year. But when I picture my life beside her, it is not his face I am trying to recover. It is simply hers I want in front of me every evening, for as long as I am given evenings to want anything in at all." I looked up at him. I did not know grief could clear a space in a man rather than only hollow one out. I know it now. Torin nodded slowly, and for once had nothing further to advise, which from a steward of his long service was its own kind of blessing. Briar came to find me not long after, still in her work apron, straw caught in the hem of her skirt, entirely unconcerned that a king knelt in the dirt of his own stable, mending a fence board like any hired hand. She crouched beside me without a word and held the next board steady while I drove the nail, and we worked together in the easy quiet that had become, without my quite marking the day it happened, the truest language between us. "Duskwing took the west paddock at a full trot this morning," she said, when the board was set. "First time in 10 years he's chosen to run rather than been asked to. I thought you would want to know before the whole household made a festival of telling you themselves." "I would rather have heard it from you," I said, "than from the whole of Cinderhall shouting it from the ramparts." "Good," she said, "because that is the only way I intend to tell you anything, from now until whenever you tire of hearing it plain." "I do not think I will tire of it," I said. "I have had a decade of people telling me only what they judged a king wished to hear. I find I would rather have the truth from you, however long it takes to arrive, than comfort from anyone else delivered promptly." She smiled at that, the real smile, the one that still came rarely enough that I counted each one like a coin too valuable to spend carelessly, and reached over to brush the sawdust from my sleeve exactly as she had brushed the trail dust from it weeks before, as though some habits, once begun between two people, simply continued of their own accord until neither party could recall which of them had started it first. I have been coming back every evening since, and I intend to keep doing so for whatever years are given to me, not because a crown or a bloodline requires it of me, but because a groom with straw in her hair once knelt outside a grieving animal's stall and asked it, gently, for its name, and in doing so taught a king how to ask for his own life back the same way.